Kansas, 1872. A man rides into Abilene with $200 in his pocket and a job lined up at the cattle yards. By the end of the week, he has neither. He didn't lose the money gambling. He didn't drink it away. It was taken from him through a system so well designed that most men never even saw it working. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know. If this is the kind of history that actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Here's a question for the comments. Have you ever walked into a place that felt welcoming on the surface, but gave you the sense that something else was happening underneath? That the friendliness was a performance? Tell us. Because the saloon was exactly that. And the men who built it knew it. Most people think they understand what a saloon was. A place to drink. A place to fight. Swinging doors. A piano in the corner. A barman wiping a glass with a dirty rag. That image exists because it was useful. It kept people from asking the more important question. The more important question is not what happened inside the saloon. It is why the saloon existed at all. Who built it? Who owned it? Who benefited from every single transaction that took place within its walls? And why, in nearly every frontier town across the American West, the saloon was finished before the church, before the school, and in many cases, before the jail. That sequence was not an accident. In the 1860s and 70s, when a new settlement was established along a rail line, a cattle route, or a mining region, the first structure that went up with any permanence was almost never a home. It was a commercial building. And the most profitable commercial building, by a margin that dwarfed everything else, was the saloon. A man with capital could open a saloon in a frontier town and begin recouping his investment within weeks. No other business operated at that speed. But here's the problem. That profitability didn't come from liquor alone. It came from everything the saloon controlled around the liquor. Think about what existed inside a saloon beyond the bar itself. Gambling tables, a back room for private meetings, sometimes a stage, a hotel space on the upper floor, a kitchen, a barber shop tucked into the side, mail delivery in some towns, legal documents signed at the counter, land agreements made in the corner. The saloon was not a single business. It was an entire infrastructure wrapped in the appearance of leisure. A farmer arriving in a new town didn't need a saloon to survive, but he needed someone to tell him which land was available, which was already claimed, and who he had to talk to. In many frontier towns, that information lived in the saloon. The men who held it charged for the privilege of sharing it, not in coin, but in obligation. And this is where things change. The owner of a saloon in a growing frontier town was not primarily a businessman in the way we understand that word today. He was something closer to a broker of access. He knew who had arrived in town this week, what they were carrying, what they needed, and how desperate they were. That information was worth more than the whiskey. Far more. A miner comes in after 6 weeks working a claim that hasn't produced. His clothes are worn through. His boots are cracked. He orders a drink and the barman is friendly, pours a generous measure, asks how things are going out there on the claim. The miner talks. He always talks. Because there is no one else to talk to. And the warmth of the saloon, the light, the noise, the sense of being among people is the first human comfort he has had in over a month. By the end of that conversation, the owner knows exactly what the miner's situation is. He knows whether the claim is worth anything. He knows whether the miner is at the point of selling. And he knows whether to approach him tonight or let him come back tomorrow when the desperation is a little deeper. This was not unusual. This was how it worked. The saloon owner in a frontier town occupied a position that had no formal name, but was understood by everyone who had been there long enough. He was the man who knew things, the man who could smooth a problem or create one, the man whose goodwill you wanted and whose opposition you did not. Think about where power actually sits in any society. It sits where information flows, where decisions get made, where money changes hands. In a frontier town with no established government, no functioning court system, no bank in many cases, no telegraph office, no newspaper, where did all of those things tend to concentrate? The saloon. Not the church, not the general store, not the land office, which often didn't exist yet. The saloon was the first functioning institution in dozens of frontier settlements, and the man who owned it was the first functioning authority. But it gets worse, because once you understand that the saloon was a power structure, you start to understand why the men who built them made the choices they made. The wide front windows weren't for aesthetics. They were so the owner, or whoever worked for him, could see who was coming in and out of town. The long bar wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to keep men standing in one place, where they could be seen, heard, and approached. The layout of a saloon was never accidental. The gambling tables were placed where they were for a reason. The back rooms existed for reasons that had nothing to do with privacy and everything to do with the negotiation of things that couldn't be discussed in front of witnesses. The stairs to the upper floor were a signal. Who went up and who was invited up and who was never invited. That told you everything about where someone stood in the social order of that town. A sheriff walking into a saloon in 1874 was not just a lawman entering a building. He was entering a rival's territory. The owner of that saloon knew things the sheriff would never know. He had relationships the sheriff couldn't access. He had financial leverage over half the men in the room. The badge meant something in theory. The saloon meant something in practice. In many towns, the practical one. Ask yourself this: if you arrived in a place with nothing but the clothes you were wearing and some cash in your pocket, who would you need to know first? The mayor? There often wasn't one. The judge? Sometimes he only visited once a month. The banker? In early settlements, the saloon was the bank. Loans extended, debts recorded, collateral held. The man behind the bar was the one institution that was always open, always present, and always watching. This is the version that never made it into the popular image of the West. The version with the piano and the whiskey and the fight that breaks out on a Saturday night. That version was a surface. The fight was a distraction. While men watched the brawl, the owner was in the back room deciding who was going to get the contract for the new supply route. Let's talk about what the saloon controlled that most people don't consider. Water. In a dry frontier settlement, a saloon needed water in quantities that most households couldn't access. The men who owned saloons often controlled or had preferential arrangements with the nearest water source. That's not a minor detail. That's a lever. Food supply. The saloon kitchen was frequently the only consistent source of prepared food in a young town, which meant that the men doing physical labor, construction crews, mining teams, railroad workers, often had no choice but to buy their meals from the saloon. The owner set the price, and the price could shift depending on how the owner felt about the men he was feeding. A crew of railroad workers arrives in a town in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, 1869. There is one building with a sign. They eat what they're given. They pay what they're told. They sleep where the owner directs them. If any man in that crew causes a problem that the owner doesn't like, the problem gets resolved quietly and the crew moves on. The company knows. The company doesn't care. The arrangement keeps the labor moving. The railroad companies themselves were not outside this system. They were participants in it. In towns that existed because of the railroad, the relationship between the rail company, the saloon owners, and the local political figures was so entangled that it is almost impossible to describe where one ended and the other began. These were not separate institutions making independent decisions. They were parts of the same engine. But here's the problem with that level of integration. When the engine serves itself, the people inside the town stop being citizens and start being assets. A man who owns a saloon, who controls the water, who owns the hotel, who holds the debts of 3 or 4 other local businesses, who has an informal arrangement with the man who will eventually become mayor, that man does not need to threaten anyone. He doesn't need to be violent. He just needs to wait. And when someone needs something, he provides it. And the cost of that provision is loyalty, silence, cooperation. In the 1870s and 80s, this structure repeated itself across hundreds of frontier towns. The names changed, the faces changed, the arrangement didn't. And this is where things change again. Because there was a point in the development of many frontier towns when the saloon owner either became the formal government or installed someone who would answer to him. In smaller settlements, the first mayor was frequently a man who had financial ties to the saloon, not because saloon owners were particularly interested in civic governance, but because civic governance was the mechanism that protected their investments. If you control the town council, you control land allocation. You control the licensing of new businesses. You control who gets to build what and where and under what conditions. You control whether a competing saloon can open across the street. You control whether the new sheriff who just arrived is going to stay or find himself reassigned somewhere inconvenient. This was not unusual. This was the system. A man tries to open a second saloon in a town in Texas, 1877. He has the money. He has the building. He applies for the license. The license is denied on a technicality. He applies again. This time, the man reviewing the application tells him there's a problem with the property boundary. The survey needs to be redone. The surveyor, who is the only one operating in the county, is not available for several months. By the time the survey is done, the man has run out of operating capital. He sells the building at a loss. The buyer, through 2 intermediaries, is the owner of the first saloon. That story happened in different forms in different places more times than anyone counted. The thing about a monopoly is that it doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to remain intact. And the saloon owner, who had established himself in a town before any competition arrived, had every incentive and every tool to ensure that his position remained singular. Now let's talk about gambling, because the gambling tables inside a saloon are usually understood as entertainment. They were not entertainment. They were a harvesting mechanism. A cattle drover arrives after 3 months on the trail. He is paid in cash. He has no way to save it, no bank to put it in, no one to send it to. He has a powerful drive to spend it, not out of stupidity, but because the combination of exhaustion, relief, and weeks of deprivation creates a state of mind where spending feels like freedom. The saloon was designed to meet that state of mind with a perfectly calibrated environment. The lights were warm and low in just the right places. The music covered the silence that might have prompted a man to think. The drinks came quickly and often at a discounted rate early in the evening, not because the owner was generous, but because a man who drinks more tends to gamble more and tends to make worse decisions the longer he sits at the table. The free drink was an investment. It returned many times its cost. The gambling itself was often rigged, not always obviously. Sometimes, very subtly, cards marked in ways that only the dealer could read, tables tilted by fractions of an inch, dice weighted just enough to shift probability over time. A man playing an honest game might lose. A man playing a subtly manipulated game would lose. The difference was time. The end result was always the same. But the gambling tables served a second function that was more important than the money they harvested directly. They created debt. When a man ran out of cash at the table, the house would often extend credit, not out of generosity, out of strategy. A man with a gambling debt to the saloon is a man who can be managed. He cannot leave town without settling the debt, and settling the debt requires either cash he doesn't have or services that the saloon owner finds useful. The debt became a tool. The man became a resource. In some towns, a significant portion of the local labor force, men working at stables, freighting companies, construction crews, even occasional law enforcement positions, were men who were working off gambling debts. They had no formal contract. They had no recourse. They worked, and they were told when the debt was clear, and they had no way to verify the accounting. This is the hidden architecture that the image of the swinging doors and the barroom brawl was built on top of. But it gets worse, because the saloon did not only extract from the men who gambled, it extracted from the town itself. Here's how that worked. A growing frontier town needed services. Roads graded, buildings constructed, supply routes established, disputes adjudicated. None of these things happened for free, and in a town with no functioning tax base and no government structure, someone had to pay for them, or appear to pay for them. The saloon owner, in an established position, frequently made public contributions to the development of a town. He funded the construction of a road. He donated lumber for the school. He hosted the gathering where the new fire brigade was organized. These acts of generosity were visible and remembered. They built social credit at a rate that far exceeded their monetary cost. And in exchange for that social credit, the owner expected, not asked, expected certain considerations. His building got connected to the new water line first. His supply wagons used the road without toll. His land claims were processed without delay. His candidates for local office won elections that very few people turned out for, because most of the population was working 6 days a week and had no practical way to participate in civic life. A man sitting at the back of a community meeting in 1878, watching the vote on whether to approve a new business license, does not know that 3 of the 5 men sitting at the table owe money to the saloon owner. He sees what appears to be a democratic process. He goes home. The license is denied. The town grows. The system deepens. The saloon owner gets richer. The man who arrived with $200 and a job lined up is still trying to find out how he lost both. Have you ever been in a situation where the rules of the game were different from what anyone told you, where the real structure was hidden behind the visible one? Think about what it would have felt like to live in that permanently. That was the frontier town. That was the saloon. Let's get specific about something that tends to get overlooked. The saloon was not a single type of institution. It ranged enormously depending on where it was, who owned it, and what moment in a town's development it occupied. In a very early settlement, a tent city, a mining camp, the first saloon might be nothing more than a plank across 2 barrels, a man with a crate of bottles, and a lantern on the ground. There was no power structure yet, because there was nothing to control. The money was liquid. The population was mobile, and the operation was crude. But that changed fast. Within months of a camp establishing itself, if it was producing or growing, the dynamic shifted. More permanent structures went up. The man with the plank and the bottles was either bought out or pushed out by someone with more capital, better connections, and a more sophisticated understanding of what the territory was worth long term. The men who built the serious saloons, the two-story buildings with the mahogany bar and the brass fixtures and the gaming room in the back, were not opportunists trying to make a quick profit. They were investors with a vision of what the town was going to become. They arrived early, they built substantial, and they planned to stay. And that distinction matters. The early drinker who just wanted to sell whiskey and move on was not the same person as the man who showed up with lumber from back east and 3 experienced card dealers and a chef and a network of contacts in the nearest city. Those were different operations, serving the same surface function, but pursuing completely different goals. The serious saloon was not in the business of selling drinks. It was in the business of controlling the environment in which every major decision in that town would eventually be made. A group of investors is considering whether to build a lumber mill near a growing Montana settlement. In 1873, they arrive in town. They need information. They need to know who owns the timber rights, whether the river is usable for transport, whether the labor is available, whether there's already someone positioned in the supply chain. Where do they go? They go to the saloon, not because it sells whiskey, because the man who owns it knows the answers to all of those questions. He has been collecting that information for 2 years, and he will share it for a piece of the deal. That negotiation doesn't happen publicly. It happens in the back room, over drinks that no one is really drinking, between men who speak carefully and commit to nothing in writing on the first night. The mill gets built. The saloon owner holds a quiet stake in it. No one in town knows his name on the ownership documents. This is the version of the West that was always hidden. Now let's go back to something that seems simple, but isn't. The location of the saloon in a frontier town was almost never accidental. The best positioned saloons sat near the rail station, or at the main crossroads, or at the point where the cattle trail entered the settlement. This wasn't just about foot traffic. It was about control of the arrival moment. The arrival moment is the most vulnerable moment for anyone entering a new place. A man steps off the train. He doesn't know anyone. He doesn't know the prices. He doesn't know which businesses are trustworthy and which will rob him. He doesn't know where to sleep or where to eat or who is currently in a position to offer him work. He is, in every practical sense, completely dependent on whatever information environment surrounds him in the first few hours. The saloon, placed at the arrival point, was the first information environment he encountered. The men who worked there, the signs on the wall, the conversations already in progress, all of it was a curated reality designed by the owner. The prices the newcomer learned first were the ones the saloon set. The jobs he heard about first were the ones that served the owner's network. The people he was introduced to first were the ones the owner wanted him to know. By the time a new arrival had been in town for 48 hours, his reality had largely been shaped by the saloon's information field, and he had no way to know it. This is where the danger lived. Not in the fights, not in the gambling, at least not directly. In the first 2 days, a man arrives from Ohio in 1875. He has heard there is good farmland available at reasonable prices. He is directed to a man in the saloon who handles land transactions. The man is friendly, knowledgeable, and produces documents. The price seems fair. The land is sold. The man from Ohio spends the next 6 months trying to work land that floods 3 times a year and has a legal encumbrance on it that was not disclosed. The man who sold it to him has left the territory. The saloon owner who introduced them cannot recall the specific conversation. That pattern repeated with enough frequency that there were men in some frontier towns whose entire livelihood was based on meeting newcomers through the saloon network and extracting value from them before they understood what they had walked into. But here's the problem with that system, long term. And this is where the story turns. A town built on extraction does not grow into stability. It reaches a point, usually, when the external resource that attracted the population in the first place begins to run dry, or when a railroad reroutes, or when the mining claim produces less, where the underlying structure collapses faster than anyone expected. The men who had been managed, manipulated, and extracted from were also the men who built the physical infrastructure of the town. When they left, and they left quickly, when conditions changed, they took their labor with them. The building stayed. The debt stayed. The complex web of financial obligation and informal power arrangement stayed, but without people moving through the system had nothing to feed on. A saloon that had been the center of a town's economy in 1872 could be a collapsed structure with broken windows by 1880. The owner who had accumulated land, debts, and informal power found that all three were worthless in a town with no population. Land without people is just dirt. Debts from men who have left the territory are not collectible. Influence requires someone to be influenced. The towns that survived, the ones that became real cities, were usually the ones where enough independent economic activity existed outside the saloon's control that when the saloon structure weakened, there was something underneath it to stand on. The towns that were built almost entirely on the saloon's infrastructure collapsed along with it, and the populations that had been extracted from scattered across the territory, carrying with them a specific and very clear understanding of what the West had actually been. They didn't write it down. They didn't tell interviewers. They just knew it, and they passed it on in the way that working people pass things on, through advice given to younger men before they made the same mistake. Don't trust the first man who offers to help you. Don't sign anything in a saloon. Don't borrow from the house. If the bartender is too friendly, he's working for someone. Those were not cynical observations. They were survival knowledge, earned at a cost that most history books don't record, because it happened to people who left no formal record. Now let's consider something that complicates the picture, because not everything about the saloon was predatory. That would be too simple. The saloon also provided something that a frontier settlement genuinely needed and had no other institution to supply: community. Not manufactured community, but real human contact in an environment where isolation was one of the most dangerous conditions a person could face. A man working a claim alone for weeks, or riding cattle for months, or grading rail track through empty territory. That man was not just physically exhausted, he was socially starved. The saloon gave him noise, warmth, other faces, other voices. It gave him the experience of being a person among people rather than a body, performing a function in an empty landscape. That need was real. The owner of the saloon knew it was real and used it. But the need itself was not manufactured. The West genuinely produced conditions of isolation that were psychologically damaging in ways that weren't fully understood at the time, and the saloon addressed those conditions. Exploitatively, yes, but genuinely. A man sits at the bar in 1876. He's been out working alone for 7 weeks. He orders a drink he can't really afford and spends 2 hours talking to the barman about nothing in particular: the weather, the cattle market, a fight that happened 3 nights ago between 2 men he doesn't know. He goes to sleep in the hotel upstairs. In the morning, he feels better. He goes back to work. The drink cost him more than it should have. The hotel cost him more than it should have. But the experience of being a human being for a few hours was real, and it kept him functional in a way that the environment alone could not. The saloon understood this and priced it accordingly. And this is where the moral picture of the West gets complicated in a way that most popular accounts don't attempt. The saloon was genuinely useful and genuinely exploitative at the same time. The owner was often providing something real while simultaneously extracting far more than that thing was worth. That combination, genuine service at unjust price, is much harder to resist than pure predation. Pure predation can be identified and avoided. Value with extraction is something people participate in willingly, often repeatedly, even when they understand at some level what is happening, because the alternative is loneliness, isolation, the absence of any human connection at all. The saloon bet on that calculation. It bet correctly, over and over again. But it gets worse, and the worst part is this. The saloon structure meant that the very act of seeking community made a man more vulnerable to the financial mechanisms that surrounded it. You couldn't walk into the saloon for the conversation without also walking into the environment where the gambling table was running. The debts were being tracked, the land deals were happening, and the information was being collected. The community and the extraction were not separate things. They were the same thing. One was the door, the other was the room behind it. A group of men at a table in 1878, talking about their week, complaining about prices, laughing at something. Genuine, real friendship, or the frontier equivalent of it. And at the next table, someone is listening. Not obviously, just paying attention. One of the men at the table mentions that he's thinking about selling his claim. He's tired. It's not producing. He might head to California. He says it the way men say things they mean, with no particular drama, just plain exhaustion. The man at the next table remembers. He mentions it to the owner later. By morning, someone has approached the tired man with a very specific offer. The price is low. The man knows it's low. But he also knows that no one else is going to offer anything, because somehow, and he can't quite explain how, the word has already gotten around that the claim is being sold. And once that word is out, the price only goes one direction. He takes the offer. He goes to California. The claim produces a modest amount the following spring, and the owner of the saloon sells it at 3 times what he paid. This was not an unusual transaction. This was the market. Now consider the people who were most exposed to this system. Not the cattlemen, who were usually part of larger organizations with their own structures and some protection from the worst of it. Not the railroad men, who worked for companies with payroll systems and camp kitchens and their own form of control that at least didn't also take your land claim. The most exposed were the independent workers, the men who arrived with a small stake and a plan to work for themselves, the placer miner, the small farmer, the freighter running a single wagon. These were men with enough independence to be vulnerable to the saloon system and not enough organization to resist it. They were also the men who built the West in the practical sense, the men whose daily labor created the conditions that made larger commerce possible. And they were the ones the saloon extracted from most efficiently. A farmer works 3 years on land that he believes he owns free and clear. In the 4th year, a man appears with a document suggesting there is a prior claim. The document may or may not be legitimate. In the early frontier legal environment, authenticity and legitimacy were not always the same thing. The farmer doesn't have money for a lawyer. The man with a document offers to settle for a payment that is just small enough to be survivable. The farmer pays. The man with a document is connected to the saloon. The payment goes through a chain of transactions that is impossible to trace. The farmer continues working his land, slightly poorer and slightly less secure, with a clear understanding that the system is not protecting him. He votes in the next local election for the candidate who has promised to reform the land office. The candidate wins. 3 months after taking office, the new land officer has lunch with the saloon owner. The reforms don't happen. Nothing changes except the face of the man managing the process. And this is the final shape of the thing. The saloon, at its most developed, was not just a commercial operation or a social institution. It was a machine for producing the appearance of normal civic life over a structure that was anything but normal. The elections were real. The laws were real. The courts, when they eventually arrived, were real. But the relationships underneath them, who owed whom, who had financed whose campaign, who held the deed to whose building, who had introduced whose lawyer to whose judge, those relationships ran through the saloon. Not every saloon, not every town. There were places where the system worked differently, where early community organizing or church networks or genuine civic spirit created alternatives to the saloon's information monopoly before the monopoly could entrench itself. But in the towns where the saloon got there first and held its position, and there were many such towns, the shape of the power structure was determined early and changed slowly. By the time formal government arrived with actual courts and actual sheriffs appointed by state authority rather than elected by local arrangement, the underlying property relationships in most of these towns were already fixed. The men who owned the land, the men who held the debts, the men who controlled the water and the supply routes, they were largely the men who had been in position since the early days, and many of them had gotten into position through the saloon. Formal government didn't overturn that. It legalized it. The frontier was not a place of freedom in the sense that most accounts suggest. It was a place where formal freedom, the absence of an established legal system, created conditions in which informal power could establish itself faster and more completely than it could in a settled society. The saloon was the primary vehicle for that informal power. The man who arrived with $200 and a job lined up didn't fail because he was weak or foolish. He failed because the system he walked into was not designed to help him succeed. It was designed to extract what he had and redirect it upward. The design worked. And here is the final question for you before we close, because I want to leave this somewhere real. When you think about a place, a community, an institution, an economy that appears to be open and welcoming, that provides something you genuinely need, and that asks only a reasonable price, how do you know whether the price is reasonable? How do you know what the actual cost is? How do you know whether the warmth is real or whether it is the first room of a much longer building? The men on the frontier had no way to know. They learned, sometimes the hard way, sometimes too late, but they learned. The saloon taught the frontier something that took generations to fully understand. The appearance of hospitality and the fact of hospitality are not the same thing. The most useful lesson the West ever produced, and it produced it through exhaustion and loss and the specific clarity that comes from having been taken, was this: understand what a place actually is before you decide what it means. The swinging doors are still swinging, in one form or another. The piano is playing something that keeps you from thinking too hard. The man behind the bar is friendly, and he's watching everything. That's Mystery Wild West, and we'll see you in the next one.